Suspension training exercises part 2, lower body. So the objectives of this module are to give an overview of lower body suspension system training exercises, provide coaching points and application for each exercise or variation, and provide guided practice for the exercises and give example lower body sessions to follow. So part 1, this presentation will look at the squatting movement exercises and supplementary exercises associated with this movement or muscles. So include the parallel stance squats, supine hamstrings or leg curls, and split squats. So we'll look at the suspension training squat, parallel squat to begin with. It's going to work the quads and glute muscles. On the coaching side, you want to focus on lowering the hips down towards the heels rather than pushing the hips backwards. You want to keep the feet flat and ensure knee track in line with the shoelaces. And this is pretty much the same for every squat movement pattern. For the regression, you want to lean back against the straps, making the squat more angled. This is going to decrease the requirements for ankle mobility and also kind of decrease the load that you're lifting. To progress, you want to move the feet backwards, making the squat more vertical and using the straps less. So here we see the squat, parallel stance squat. See, we're leaning back a reasonable degree, lower the hips downwards at an angle towards the heels. As I said, we want to keep the feet flat, heels down on the floor, and the knees are tracking in line with the shoelaces, they're not caving inwards. The more we use the arms to assist us on the way up, the easier it will be. But this doesn't require much movement or mobility at the ankle joint and is therefore quite a remedial, easy exercise. Now, in order to progress the exercise, we could look to do what we refer to as a squat with a weight shift. You want to perform the descent or the downward phase, leaning backwards, as we kind of just did with the previous version. Difference with this one is you're going to pause at the bottom, you're going to shift your weight forwards, dorsiflexion at the ankles, so the knees are going to move forwards, and this is going to place slack on the straps. You're then going to stand upwards without the use of the straps, and then at the top, lean back and repeat. So this drill is a very good drill to help mobilize the ankles and create a greater flexibility or mobility into dorsiflexion. So here we see this exercise being performed then. So we're going to do the descent or the downward phase, the eccentric phase, leaning backwards. At the bottom then we shift ourselves forward. Try to keep your heels flat on the ground so the movement is occurring at the ankles. And then we're going to stand up without the use of the straps and with the upper body. So we use this to help create mobility. The reason we do this is that some people struggle to dorsiflex on the way down and the way up. So we get into the bottom position, then we shift our weight forwards, and then we just do the ascent in a more vertical plane. Now the other way of progressing the suspension training squat is to perform it weighted. And we can do this in a variety of different ways. In this one, we're doing it with the kettlebell in the kind of rack position. Now you can do it with a little bit of arm assistance. So the one that's holding the strap can help you up a little bit. Or you could do it kind of more angled throughout. But again, all the coaching points are the same. Feet flat on the ground, hips strapped down towards the heels. So we can hold the kettlebell in rack, in between the legs, or dumbbell. Variety of different additional loads that we can use to make the exercise more challenging. So additional variations, we could also do complex movements. So we could do a squat push press, and again you can do this with a kettlebell or a dumbbell. So you squat down and then on the way up you use that momentum to help drive the kettlebell overhead into a press. We could do a squat curl push press where you curl the weight up, and again this is best done with a dumbbell. Or we could do a squat clean push press with a kettlebell. So you start with the kettlebell in between the legs, and then on the way up you clean it up into the rack position and then push press it up above the head. Other parallel stance variations, where we could do a sumo squat. So this is a wide stance squat. In this case we're kind of holding the kettlebell in between the legs. Could also be done with a dumbbell, and also could be done with the kettlebell held in the rack position. So you see when it's in between the legs it may limit the range of motion very slightly. So wider stance is going to kick in more adductors, a little bit more quads as well. But if you're looking for an additional variation for a weighted squat, this works quite well. Now we've got a couple of variations which are very similar. Again, we're kind of progressing from that wide stance of a sumo squat. We can do a lateral squat or a skater squat. Very similar. A lot of people sometimes get confused between the two. A lateral squat, we adopt the same wide stance, so usually feet turned out slightly, and you squat down to one side. With a lateral squat, you then stand back up to the middle, kind of start point, and then you squat back down. So you almost make this kind of triangle-like shape, going down onto one leg, and then up to the middle, and then down to the other leg. With a skater squat, you perform the lateral squat, so the descent of the first leg looks very similar, but instead of standing up in the middle between each repetition, you actually keep yourself down low and literally just shift yourself laterally until you're squatting on the other leg. And then you keep moving from side to side, but keeping this kind of descended position. So the next exercise we will look at is suspension system hamstring curls or leg curls. A lot of people are usually kind of familiar with this exercise. You can do it with a stability ball as well. I will show you the difference with a suspension system, and there's a few variations that we'll go through with this exercise as well. So the idea is to work the hamstrings, the glutes to a certain extent, the posterior core muscles. It's very much a knee flexion exercise, and that's what works the hamstrings. But you can also keep your hips extended, so it will also work them kind of proximally at the same time. On the coaching sides, the way we coach it to people, we want to focus on dragging your heels towards the hips. And you want to look, if you can, to maintain a straight line between the shoulders, hips and knees. There are different variations of this, but this is the one we'll go through. So as you can see with that image in the background, we have the kind of knees, hips and shoulders in a nice straight line throughout the exercise, whether the knee is flexed as it is in the image or extended as we are in the start position. So the regression, make it easier, you can flex the hips as you flex the knees. So effectively what happens is you keep the hips down low and you just keep that same kind of body position. You can also, which is unique to the suspension system as opposed to a stability ball, you can shift the start position more towards the feet. So as we see where he is now, if we shift him so his feet are further under the anchor point or beyond the anchor point, so moving towards the feet, that will make the exercise easier. To progress it, well, on the image you can see the arms are on the floor. That actually helps you. You can kind of use your lats to help elevate your hips up. If you put your arms across your chest and you don't get that assistance, that will definitely make it harder. It also makes it slightly more unstable. The other way of progressing it is to shift the start position more towards the head. So as we see him here, we would just shift him to the right for the start position, and that would add more resistance to the exercise. So here we see this being performed then. So as soon as you kind of flex at the knees, as soon as you start to drag your heels towards you, you want to focus on pushing your hips up towards the ceiling. As you say, we can kind of use the arms for a bit of assistance if you want to make it easier, or arms across the chest will make it harder. What differs this exercise from the stability ball is you can obviously make the exercise easier and harder, which is what you can't do with a stability ball. So variations, well, we can just do a bridge to begin with, and this is an isometric version, and this helps to teach the start and finish position for the hamstring curl exercise. So all we do here is you lift the hips off the ground, and you may hold this position for 30 to 60 seconds. So we see the position there, just going to hold in this straight line. Again, we can make it slightly harder by lifting the arms and putting them across the chest rather than utilizing the lats to help kind of lift and bridge the hips off the floor. Other variations, well, we could do the same exercise but do it as a single leg bridge. So we only put one foot in the straps, and again this isometric version is going to challenge the hip extensor endurance just one leg at a time. So again, we would look to do this for minimum 20 seconds up to kind of 60 seconds and just trying to hold that position. Now the other version we'll show you, or variation we'll show you, is this bridging. So what we do here is you actually start with the legs or the knees flexed, and you keep the feet still, or still as you can, and then we just bridge the hips up. So this is kind of like a short bridge version. Keeping the feet as still as possible, and we're just bridging up. You may hold that for a few seconds, lower the hips down towards the floor, Normally we stop just before they hit the floor and then we bridge back up again. And then what you can do is almost kind of combine a couple of those versions. So if you have someone that struggles to do the full hamstring curl exercise, both the eccentric and concentric phases, then we can focus just on the eccentric phase. So what we do here is we actually start with the knees bent and the hips on the ground. So almost kind of just start with the hips on the ground, bring your knees up towards your chest, but without lifting your hips off the floor. And then you bridge upwards, kind of like what we just saw with the previous version. Once you're in that top position, then you extend the legs into the kind of isometric long bridge position. So you're just performing the eccentric phase of the leg curl. Once you're in that long bridge position, you lower the hips down to the ground, bring your knees back up to your chest, bridge up and repeat. So this is good for improving the hamstring strength when an individual struggles to perform the full version of the hamstring or leg curl exercise. Other variations where we can do alternating hamstring curls, where we have both feet in the straps and you effectively flex one knee up towards you at a time. You'll get a little bit of flexion of the other knee. See, this generally works best when you're doing it with a two-strap system rather than a single strap suspension system, just because you're kind of varying the load that you're putting through each one, and single strap suspension systems tend to slip a little bit when you do this exercise. And then the other variation of this is what we do is what we refer to as fast alternating hamstring curls. So similar to the previous version, but it's done on a much quicker velocity, and you actually try to keep your hips in the same position. So whereas with the previous video you're actually bridging up with each rep, we don't do this on this repetition. So you keep your hips down and you perform a rapid flexion extension movement with each leg. So effectively you're straightening and bending the leg very quickly. Now, to decelerate the knee extension, you're going to use the hamstrings, and this is a very good way of training the hamstrings because they are used for knee extension deceleration. So you're trying to stop before you actually get to full extension. The idea is not to kind of completely lock the legs out. So as we said, it's very good for improving the hamstring's ability to decelerate, or eccentric loading, which is a major issue, a major requirement for hamstrings and injury prevention. So here we see this being performed then. So we kind of start in our bridge position. Now if you focus on the hips, there's no movement at the hips. They're trying to keep them up off the ground. So we are going to get a little bit of hip flexion as we do this. But yeah, as we see here, we're pushing the foot away, decelerating it. And it's a lot of hamstring activation. We're also going to be working the hip extensors to keep the hips off the ground as well. But this is a tough drill to do. You may not want to do this for a full 30 seconds, but it is very good, like we said, for training the hamstrings eccentrically. And then one of the toughest variations we have is what we call a single leg hamstring curl. So you just have one foot in the straps and you do that same hamstring and bridging movement. Very hard. Can be done with a kind of stability ball as well, but it's a little bit too unstable. But the suspension system, this is probably the kind of hardest version you can kind of do in order to do when you're training the hamstrings with this kind of leg curl movement. So don't expect everybody or your clients to be able to do this. This is a tough variation. And then the final exercise we're looking at with this presentation is the split squat movement. So split squat's just effectively being 1 foot forward, 1 foot backward. So it's not a lunge, you're not actually kind of stepping into it, it's just 1 foot forward and 1 behind. Now when the rear foot is elevated, that's referred to as a Bulgarian split squat. So our rear foot in this case is elevated up within the suspension system, so you're just going to be using one of the straps. And this is going to be good for working the quads, glutes, and to a certain extent anterior core muscles for a little bit of stabilization. Very good also for mobilizing the rear leg hip flexor. So if you look at the image, it's very good for stretching or mobilizing that right hip flexor. On the coaching side, you want to keep the core braced to prevent any lumbar overarching or overextension. And again, like with most squatting, you want to ensure that the knee tracks in line with the shoelaces. So the squatting leg, the left leg in the image, we just want to make sure that knee's not caving in. To progress this, well, if we place the strap slightly higher up, then it's going to mobilize the hip flexor a little bit more. So here we see the Bulgarian split squat in action. You're going to place the rear foot or rear leg in that strap, and then you're going to squat down. You can kind of play around with the arm position. Some people like to place their opposite arm forwards as they drop down, as you see with the video. But we're trying to control this effectively, this kind of single leg emphasis squat. So as you do need to kind of utilize your ankle, knee and hip stabilizers in order to make sure your knee's tracking in the right direction. We try and squat down nice and low. In the coaching, we try and push back the rear strap as you squat down there. Now, we can vary the exercise by adding additional load. In this case, it's very minimal load, but we're trying to make it a little bit harder by effectively doing it in a kind of overhead squat position. So in this case, we're keeping the weight quite light, just holding like a battle rope above our head, and then we're squatting down. So this is actually quite tough on the anterior core for stabilization. It does make it a little bit more difficult from the balance side of things because you need to mobilize at the shoulders as well as through the lower body for the squat. Could also be done with a very light bar like a body pump bar or something like that. Now, other Bulgarian split squat variations, you could add a press to that movement. So you could either do it as a unilateral or bilateral press, so either on one side or both sides. Again, using dumbbells, kettlebells, a common piece of kit to use for that. We could add rotation to that movement. Again, it's going to make it more challenging just to control the position. So we would hold a medicine ball or something similar in front, and then as you squat down, you rotate over that lead leg. So if you're looking at the image, if you're holding a medicine ball there, we'd rotate to the left as you drop down. And then you'd swap legs and rotate to the right on the other side. You could also do it in a bent over position, less commonly seen, this variation. It does work quite well for cyclists and people like that that need to kind of do this squatting movement whilst in a bent over position. So you perform the squat as we have done with the previous videos, but you do it with the torso in a more bent over position. So you almost kind of flex at the hips at the beginning. So the torso is almost parallel with the ground, and then you squat up and downwards in that position. Again, if you want to add load, you could add a light weight plate that you just hold across your chest if you want to make it a little bit more challenging as well. And then we have the dynamic method of increasing the intensity of the exercise. So we add a little jump to it. So you do that same Bulgarian split squat, but as you come upwards on the ascent, you drive upwards so that foot leaves the ground, almost kind of bring the rear knee up to help assist you. And obviously you then have to control the landing, control the additional ground reaction forces, which is going to make it a lot harder and a lot more challenging on the stabilization as well. Okay, so that's all for the first part. If you move on to the next presentation, you can check out the other exercises for the lower body suspension training.